Okay, dear participants, welcome to this second panel of the Global Deal High-Level Forum on Just Transitions and Sustainable Labor Markets. It's my pleasure, my honor to moderate this second panel with such distinguished panelists. And I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity given to me to be in this panel and to moderate it. The panel focuses on the question of non-standard forms of work and the role of social dialogue in managing them. Let me start by saying that whether these are called non-standard forms of work, diverse forms of work arrangement, or new forms of work, these forms of work and employment have become an important feature of the labor market across the world. In a context of deep transformations affecting the world of work, brought by globalization, technological advancement, and other driving forces, including climate change, demographic shift, but also crisis and shocks, like the one that we hopefully are just getting out of. Their overall importance have increased over the past decades, and their use have become widespread across most economic sectors, occupations as shown by statistics coming from different countries and different regions. There is a widespread consensus among policymakers, the social partners, and labor market experts and observers that the use of different forms of non-standard forms of work or diverse forms of work arrangement can help businesses to navigate difficult periods by providing flexibility in organizing their workforce. These forms of work can also facilitate access to employment and help retain workers in the labor market by providing them with greater autonomy in their working time arrangement. However, temporary work arrangement can also impact negatively stable employment relationship if used to organize recurrent work at the expense of motivated, skilled, and productive permanent workforce. And this observation is in line with the conclusions of the tripartite meeting of experts organized by the ILO in 2015, which examined the challenges for the decent work agenda that non-standard forms of employment can generate. The adopted conclusions then underlined both opportunities and challenges associated with such forms of employment. They also emphasized the unique role of social dialogue in this context. And the conclusions called upon member states, employers, and workers' organizations to work together to devise policy solutions so that all workers, irrespective of their employment arrangement, could benefit from decent work conditions. And this is precisely the core of our panel today. That is to examine the role of social dialogue when it comes to managing in an appropriate and a balanced way the use of all forms of work, including non-standard forms of employment. That is, first of all, how tripartite social dialogue can help reform labor laws to govern temporary forms of employment. But also, secondly, how the social partners, through bipartite social dialogue, at different levels of the economy, national, sector, and enterprise level, can negotiate more tailor-made approaches that better fit the needs of sectors and enterprises. And to talk about this topic, the importance, role of social dialogue as a critical tool in dealing with transitions in the labor market, we have 5 distinguished panelists, 2 representing government, 2 representing the social partners, and 1 representing one non-governmental organization. So we are very pleased to have Mr. Pierre-Yves Darman, who is the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Economy and Employment of Belgium, Bonjour, and thank you for being with us, Mr. Derman. We have also Mrs. Sandra Hassan joining us online. Mrs. Sandra Hassan is the Deputy Minister of Labour and Associate Deputy Minister of Employment and Social Development of Canada. We have Mr. Sylvain Lobry, Vice President for Social Dialogue and Social Fundamentals of the French Danone company. We have Luca Vicentini, who is the General Secretary of the European Trade Union Confederation, also joining us from Brussels, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, exactly.
Last but not least, we are very pleased to have Mrs. Melissa Duncan. She's the Executive Director of Fair Trade International, that is very active in the area also of supply chains and also promoting fair and sustainable labor markets. As it was the case for the previous panel, I will be asking to each of our panelists one question, and they will have 5-6 minutes to respond. First round, and then I will be also asking them a question, same question to all of them, to build upon the first responses we received from you on the first question. So again, thank you very much for being with us. Pleasure to have you. And let me start with you, Mr. Pierre-Yves Derman. The coalition agreement that the current government of Belgium adopted in September 2020 aims to address the situation whereby agency workers depend on daily contracts by the same employer that are continuously rolled over during a long period of time. That agreement stipulated that the social partners should be involved in this endeavor. So the question to you, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, is how has this been followed up, and to what extent the social partners have been involved in framing that agreement?
Hello, good evening, everybody. Thank you, dear Youssef, for this presentation and for your questions. Before anything else, I would like to thank the Spanish government for having organized this forum. I'd also like to thank the OECD teams and the WTO for setting up and their contributions to this event and all the dynamics of the global deal. We are convinced from the government of Belgium of the importance of social dialogue generally, but even more so in periods of fundamental transformations of our economy, of our world of labor, in order to accompany that transformation and to regulate them. You mentioned this, the government agreement, which brings together the 7 parties in the government, foresaw the regulation and the use of successive day contracts to prevent employers from using these intermediate contracts, temporary contracts, so that they don't overuse it, with the negative consequences that can have for workers. We've talked with social partners. We have given them that request to fight against irregular uses or problematic use of this succession of temporary contracts. And then the social partners, after a year of negotiation, finally came to an agreement in July. In order to limit the use of these successive temporary contracts, daily contracts, and this has been set up by the government last month. It will come into force on the 1st of January 2023. It foresees guaranteeing identical rights to workers with indefinite contracts, to respect times and conditions of work and protection against accidents at work. And it's also, the agreement also sees that the companies that too frequently rely on temporary contracts will have to pay a supplementary amount for the social security. So there would be a kind of a penalization which would correct or respond to this overuse, this using these temporary contracts too often, but also with the involvement of the social partners and for the assessment of the control and general framework. So the social partners were at the source of this mechanism. It was set up by the government, and it'll be in force on the 1st of January 2023, and the social partners will continue to be associated to the setting up of this mechanism and for its oversight and assessment, and the will being, of course, that the social partners will continue to be attached to it, to the mechanisms, and to have their say in the setting up of the mechanisms. So social dialogue is at the heart of labour rights and the economic policies of the federal Belgian government. The importance of social dialogue, that's at the heart of the mechanism in Belgium in order to ensure labour conditions that are decent with all of these groups that work in this new way of work.
And social partners have been asked to advise on a law, the so-called labor deal. So this law introduces the presumption that in labor law that unless proven to the contrary, a platform worker is a dependent employee. What was the added value provided again by the social partners, and how did the government of Belgium take into account their advice and their proposals in the final version of the law?
Alors, c'est une excellente.
Well, that's an excellent question. It also allows me to shed a light at the same time as I have just done on the successes of the agreements among social partners, and also the difficulties in order to formulate a unanimous proposal among representatives of the workers and representatives of the employers. And what was the case in Belgium with regards to the situation and the regulation of the platform economy within the Belgian government? We wanted to fit this development of the platform economy by acknowledging certain types of progress which allow these kinds of economies, but also pointing out the difficulties and the risks, notably in terms of work conditions and standards and rights of work and social security. And we wanted to contribute a reply. We talked to the social partners by asking them to formulate some proposals for regulation, for control of the platform economy. But unfortunately, on this subject, the social partners were not able to formulate to the government a common unanimous proposal. Nevertheless, we wanted to bear in mind all the different proposals and comments made by the workers' representatives and the employer representatives, and also to be inspired strongly by the proposal formulated by the European Commission, and particularly by the Commissioner Nicolas Schmit concerning this proposal of a directive in order to contextualize platform work. And so we have taken up many of the criteria proposed by Nicolas Schmit and his team in the proposal of the European directive by integrating them and allowing them to correspond to the rights of work applicable in Belgium. And we have obtained a majority in order to vote that text, and so from the 1st of January 2023, indeed, a presumption can be implemented for workers in the platform economy who work within this platform economy in a regular way, or so that they can work in a structured way, with the possibility also for those who would do it under a system of independent or workers to be covered against accidents at work. And so the platforms have to have a protection insurance against to protect against work accidents when they are autonomous. There's an intermediate or supplementary which we didn't go on to. So we wanted to remain within the context of the two statutes about independent or salaried workers, with a series of criteria when they are present mean that there is a presumption of a work contract and of a wage. And we also wanted to involve the social partners in the context of what we call the Commission for work relations, which gives warnings about the qualification of a work contract or a work relationship under the regime of independent worker, to give the Commission more power so that they can take decisions ahead of time and define a salaried relationship, an autonomous relationship in the specific context of the platform economy, or as we saw before, understanding that algorithms will be used within the organization to for this relationship for autonomous wage earners and data platform services. And that is how the Belgian government, together with the social partners, in spite of the fact that the social partners were not able to formulate a common, unanimous formula, we've been able to make progress in the regulation of work by getting inspired strongly and directly from the ambitious proposal put forward by Commissioner Nicolas Schmit.
For this very interesting experience of how in Belgium the work of the social partners, but also the efforts made by the government, some information coming from the European Commission helped you to reach a consensus and to adopt a law to regulate this question of platform workers. This brings me to Mrs. Hassan from Canada, because in Canada the COVID-19 crisis has exposed the vulnerability of platform workers, but also the extent to which all of us are depending on their services. In this context, the Minister of Labour of Canada has a mandate commitment to advance amendments that entitle platform workers to job protection in the federal sector. Would you be willing, Madam Deputy Minister, to share with us some background information on this initiative and on the types of policy responses being considered and explored under this mandate commitment?
Merci beaucoup pour...
Well, thank you very much for your question, and good evening to you all. First of all, I would like to thank the Secretariat of the Global Deal for having invited me. That is right. In Canada, we are committed to make changes, allowing workers in data platforms, and more generally speaking, also workers on demand, to benefit from protection measures for employment in the federal sector. All workers deserve having their rights and their well-being has to be protected no matter how they carry out their work. The measures of protection for employment have to continue to evolve in order to guarantee work conditions that are decent and safe and certain. You know that on-demand workers are faced with many challenges at work. They often have limited access to protection measures for existing work, like the right to negotiate collectively, for example, and protection for health and social security and safety at work, and also fundamental rules at work. And very often, it gives rise to a mistaken classification when the employers are classified as independent entrepreneurs, which is a status which is not covered by most of the protections. On-demand workers or independent workers, self-employed workers, have a weak negotiation power because they don't have the sufficient numbers to be able to negotiate. And also, it's also due to the limited possibility of expression of collective representation in on-demand the economy. Our on-demand economy is very fragmented and transitory. They often don't know each other. And with regard to this, the government of Canada has studied a certain number of strategic solutions, including measures in order to remedy the mistaken classifications and also to improve the collective representation in the on-demand economy under federal regulations. In order to contribute to the development of our strategic solution, the government of Canada has carried out consultations among all the stakeholders in order to better understand the experiences and the situations of the self-employed, the on-demand workers, including those who have through data platforms. And notably, we have had interviews with more than 30 experts on a variety of subjects linked to on-demand workers, including people who work through data platforms. And we have had virtual roundtables with employers and with the trade unions. And we have also had meetings of target groups.
Thank you for this very interesting description of this mandate commitment to ensure and to guarantee the same rights to all segments of workers, and in particular those that are working in the platform economy. Madam Deputy Minister, I understand that the authority over labor legislation in Canada is divided between the provinces and the federal government. So the question here is, are the provinces also currently exploring similar legislative changes as those being examined by the federal authorities? And linked to this, could you please elaborate on how the federal government plans to foster harmonization and alignment across Canadian jurisdictions on this particular issue of securing the same rights to all segments of workers, including those in the platform economy?
Merci.
Thank you for your question. You are right to underline that the authority in terms of work legislation is divided in different levels of government. In fact, the vast majority of on-demand work, including data platform work, comes under the provincial or territorial responsibilities for labor, so that all on-demand workers in Canada can benefit from the right protections. It's important that strategic responses are set up at all levels of government and governments. And that is why we have collaborated and we continue to cooperate with the provinces and the territories with intergovernmental committees in order to exchange his exemplary practices and strategic ideas for the on-demand economy in order to ensure that Canadians are able to find good employment. The Government of Canada has undergone organized consultations in order to better understand the experiences of on-demand workers, even those who work on data platforms and whose status is not clearly covered by the provincial or federal laws. This work will allow us to clarify the way in which the measures of employment protection may be adapted for those workers. When we look at a provincial level, the province of Ontario has recently adopted the law on the rights of workers of data platforms. This law is one of the basic protection laws for certain workers of data platforms under provincial regulations. And like drivers and others are also looking for some political responses in order to better protect self-employed workers in their own territories. And the legislative changes, which should occur at a federal level, will continue to supply leadership for the corresponding changes in all the provinces and in all territories. And I thank you with that.
Madame
Thank you very much, Mrs. Deputy Minister.
a bien compris qu'il y a une articulation très importante entre le niveau fédéral et le niveau provincial au Canada pour s'assurer que le changement a lieu non seulement au niveau fédéral, mais aussi au niveau des provinces. Et ce que vous avez dit sur la province de l'Ontario est très intéressant avec cette loi adoptée.
And with that law that was adopted in order to ensure the rights for all the workers of the platform economies.
Our social partners, and I will start with Mr. Sylvain Lobry. In 2016, in the 2016 agreement with the International Union of Food Workers, Danone company committed to promote direct and open-ended employment and to monitor and negotiate employment practices together with the International Union of Food Workers on this issue of ensuring and promoting rather direct and open-ended employment. 6 years later, what can other large businesses learn from your experience in trying to limit insecure forms of work in a way that supports both employment stability and business sustainability?
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share this experience. Danone is engaged in social dialogue and in the contribution of social dialogue to business performance for decades. It's really at the core of the identity of the company. And the relationship with the IUF, the International Union of Food Workers, is also a long-lasting story, starting in the 1980s with 10 global framework agreements that we've signed with the IUF to really define our social policy and to embed it in the social dialogue. This agreement that you refer to is the last one of the series of the 10 agreements, focusing on sustainable employment and access to rights. This is very at the core of our discussion this afternoon. What is it about? It's really an acknowledgement from the company and from the IUF about the negative impact of precarious work to the life of the workers. And of course, the first lack of access to rights is the lack of access to collective bargaining or union or access to representation by unions. But broader than that, it's also access to a normal life with very fundamental elements of life that are not accessible to these workers. So the acknowledgement of that is the starting point. We also acknowledge in this agreement the nature of our business and the fact that we have to adapt to the variability of demand, and our business practices need also to adapt to this. So we need, therefore, to find the right balance between those two elements. How do we do that? So the agreement defines a method to analyze jobs and to analyze them under the fundamental principles that a permanent job must be supported, must be covered by a permanent contract. This is quite simple, but this is very difficult to put into practice. So this analysis applies, by the way, to Danone jobs, internal jobs, but also to the jobs of our contractors that work on our premises for different kind of services, to also influence and make sure that those contractors are following the same rules. This makes, in fact, big difference to the life of the workers, also to the organization. So what are the learnings? Clearly, the main learning is that it is a revolution. So many habits are based on the fact that temporary work is the default status. It's really a big change for business teams, for management teams in many different countries across Danone. Danone is present in roughly 50 countries around the planet. And for many local cultures, this is a revolution because, in fact, often the statement is, this is the way we do here. Why would we change, whereas the whole market is driven this way? So it's really something which needs to be changed in the habits, in the awareness of all people. Let me share also that it's a revolution for unions as well, because we have, in fact, since 2016, a limited number of requests coming from unions. Unions are, in many cases, more focused on increasing the rights of the permanent workers, as opposed to onboarding or welcoming new workers to this corpus of rights. So this is also a change in the habits, a change in the understanding of the organization itself. So it requires a lot of change management, of communication, of onboarding. We do it jointly with the IUF, and we have organized a process of joint visits to the countries to explain about the agreement and to onboard both parties on forums of discussions to really make it real. So this is, in a nutshell, the main learning I want to stress and to share this afternoon.
Thank you very much for that description of this long-standing experience and practice in Danone. But I wanted to ask you a question. What explains this long-standing experience? How comes that since the early 80s, 10 global framework agreements have been concluded? What's behind this? What is, you talked about revolution for the unions, for the company, but I was expecting one word, but that it did not come out. So I meant trust. So is there a trust? What explains this, long-standing experience of coming, with such a big number of framework agreements since almost 40 years?
Yes, there is trust in this relationship, definitely. But let me share that the core of the identity of Danone, as stated by our CEO, back in the 1970s, Antoine Riboud, is what we call the dual economic and social project of Danone. So the conviction, the belief, the very deep belief that business performance and social progress go hand in hand and will ensure the long-term sustainability and the long-term success of our business. And as a result of that, we have developed a governance at Danone which is based on counterpowers. We believe that we are managing the company better, that our management teams are doing a better job when they have in front of them people who can challenge, who can really negotiate and enter into open discussions to improve what we do. This is what we do with the IUF, and this is what we do with unions in every local market we are operating with. And this is building trust. Sometimes it builds also disagreement. It builds very tough discussions because there are some very tough issues to tackle. But over the long term, because of this commitment, it creates definitely trust. It creates also a drive for true negotiation where we can challenge the status quo. And in this area of sustainable employment, as I was mentioning, we need to have open negotiations, not only on onboarding new workers to these rights, but also on challenging our work organization to welcome them, challenging our classification to allow lower qualified workers to enter into this classification of work. So this is something which is challenging, which is based on trust, but also based on the courage to enter into tough discussions.
Thank you very much. So on above trust, there is also the courage of the social partners to engage and to commit and to reach agreements. And I think also one of the lessons is the win-win. So this agreement serves the interest of the company, but also the interest of the workers. Thank you very much for that very interesting description of the long-standing experience of Danone with its counterpart from the workers to promote decent employment. Let me now turn to Mr. Luca Vicentini, the General Secretary of the ETUC, and ask him a question about the social agreement to reform labor law and to strike a better balance between the adaptability and stability of employment that have been recently negotiated and adopted in Spain, Netherlands, and Sweden, to see whether there are also similarities. And here the question is, what are the main lessons from this social dialogue agreement, and how can their approach inspire others, not only in Europe, but also beyond Europe? And also, what can we also learn from the importance of resorting and using social dialogue on this particular issue of balancing stability and adaptability of employment?
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this very interesting discussion. I'm really sorry not to be able to be there with you in person, but it's anyway very important for me, to have the possibility to express some considerations. Coming to your question, you mentioned three important social dialogue agreements that have led to redesigning the national legislation. Spain, the most important and probably our benchmark in this moment in terms of agreements and also legislation reform, but also the Netherlands, Sweden. We have heard about also some legislative reform that took place in Belgium, although without a possible agreement between the social partners. A similar situation we had also in Portugal. So there are many countries in Europe that are developing, let's say, reframing, I would say, of the rules when it comes to non-standard work, in particular in the digital economy, but not only. There are differences, of course, between these different agreements and between the different legislative reforms, but there are indeed some concrete lessons that can be taken out of these different developments that can be considered common lessons, I would say. The first one is that, standard work is not only about platforms. It's not only about the digital economy. Standard work has started developing years and years, decades ago, I would say, and has gone through different developments and transformations over time. And unfortunately, we have to say that not only in sectors like the digital economy, where flexibility is absolutely required, but also in very traditional sectors, very often non-standard work is excessively used, I would say. If you think about people being forced to become self-employed in domestic work or in the building sector or in the agriculture, where it's clear that in this case flexibility has been definitely abused. So we need to be very careful and distinguish that different situations take place and not always non-standard work and flexibility are used in a proper manner. So we need to analyze the different sectors and the different characteristics of non-standard work, bearing this in mind. And this is, I would say, the first lesson that we need to take into account. The second element that comes out very clearly from all these agreements and all these legislative reforms is that the strong push that came from some political actors, but also employer side, to try to create, to define a third category of workers that is something in between normal and traditional employment on the one side and on the other side self-employment. Well, this attempt has to be stopped, because this is not the proper manner to address the problems. we need, on the contrary, to understand exactly why non-standard work can be necessary in some circumstances and make sure that it doesn't bring forward any elements of exploitation or excessive insecurity. There are either workers, employees, that can be in a standard situation or in a non-standard situation, and on the other side there are self-employed workers that perform their services and their activities in a condition of proper and genuine self-employment. Mixing up these two categories is very dangerous because it just leads to loopholes in the legislation and also in the protection of workers. And then the third lesson is about what do we mean when we talk about flexibility. Flexibility, as I say, can be necessary, but it's very important that we don't allow flexibility to be misused, just to have shortcuts, just to save money through cheap labor, just to violate or discriminate people in terms of human rights, workers' rights, and the possibility to join a union or to have access to proper social protection or collective bargaining or decent wages. Flexibility has to be an instrument to be used to have better labor performances while at the same time protect people in a proper manner. And in this respect, again, it's on the one side about putting in place proper forms of negotiation that can allow the social partners, companies and workers' representatives, trade unions, to define what are the conditions and the characteristics of this flexibility. It's clear that in situations or in companies like Danone, big companies with a long-standing tradition for negotiations, it's much easier. There is collective bargaining in place. The trade unions negotiate with the employer, with the management to resolve problems and to make sure that flexibility doesn't turn into insecurity and exploitation. But we have to be aware that this is not the case everywhere. First of all, because collective bargaining is not covering all the companies in Europe. Unfortunately, on the contrary, it covers only a minority of companies, mainly big and mid-sized companies, and not in all the countries. I mean, discussing about this means that we need to be able, I will say, to extend as much as possible the practice of collective bargaining and negotiations to all the companies in a way that we can really negotiate properly for non-standard workers the conditions for this flexibility to kick in, and to make sure that these people can really have access to decent wages, to proper working conditions, to be protected in terms of health and safety, but also to have proper access through social protection, a proper pension at the end of their career, and making sure also that there is no social contribution avoidance from the companies when it comes to non-standard workers, and this is unfortunately too often the case. But as I say, only a few companies we have collective agreements, only a few companies we have proper social dialogue in industrial relations. That's why we need to have, on the one side, proper legislation to be put in place, and on the other side also try to find ways to put together small and medium enterprises in cluster collective bargaining, in collective bargaining that must be at sectoral level, that can cover all the workers, all the employees in a certain sector, making sure that also non-standard workers are included in the collective bargaining rounds and industrial relations addressing that specific sector. Company level negotiations are not enough to protect workers in general, and for sure are not enough to protect workers when they are in a non-standard situation. This is something that we need to improve, because at the moment the coverage of collective bargaining, as I said, is insufficient, and very often the legislation, except for the few countries that we have just mentioned, the legislation at national level doesn't help in resolving these kind of problems. We managed in the past at the European level to push forward an important directive that ruled and covered properly and efficiently, I would say, a specific sector of non-standard work, that is temporary work agencies. With the temporary work agency, thanks to the directive, then we were able to negotiate national and cross-border agreements to make sure that workers working for temporary work agencies were protected properly and had the same rights and the same kind of protection of the standard employment and standard workers. Well, now now we have the problem to extend this kind of best practices also to other sectors where there is no collective bargaining, there are no rights recognized, and there is no proper access to social protection. Platform is, of course, the top of the iceberg, but it's not the only situation that we are facing in terms of exploitation and insecurities, as I say. And on top of all this, there is also the problem that even when it's not about non-standard employment, but about genuine self-employment, also for those workers, there is an issue in terms of granting them access to the possibility to become members of a union, to organize themselves, to make sure that they can get proper negotiating power, they can enter into collective bargaining rounds to protect themselves, although they are self-employed. And last but not least, also to self-employed workers, we need to guarantee proper access to social protection and to proper pension systems at the end of their work career. So there is a lot of work to be done. It's true that in some situations, like the countries that we have mentioned, the social partners were able to reach agreements among themselves, and these agreements have been turned into proper legislation, and we are very happy of the results that these countries have achieved, and we have really to praise and to congratulate the social partners and also the governments that have been able in this tripartite format of social dialogue to achieve these important results. But as I say, not everywhere is possible to reach agreements between social partners. Sometimes there is not even the willingness or the attitude to negotiate. In some cases, there is not even, let's say, the proper legislative framework to allow social partners to negotiate and to reach agreements, and not all the governments are available to go in this direction. That's why it will be very, very important to have international, supranational legislation to help the social partners and the governments to deliver better legislation and better collective agreements. In this respect, the fact that the European Commission has decided to push forward this proposal for a directive on platform work is a first step. It's still insufficient because it covers only platform work and not all non-standard work. And second, because some provisions in the proposed directive are not enough, to resolve the problems that are at stake. Nevertheless, of course, we will continue keeping the dialogue open and alive, because it's only through dialogue and through proper negotiations and industrial relations that we can really achieve better results for the working people in these specific sectors. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Vicentini, for this very interesting contribution to our debate on the role of social dialogue in securing a balance between, as you said, flexibility, which can be necessary, but also the importance and the imperative of ensuring workers' protection. And you mentioned also the critical role of the legislation to help the social partners move forward the social dialogue. Let me now move to Mrs. Melissa Duncan with a question as follows. Agricultural workers in global supply chains often lack formal employment contracts or are otherwise subjected to time limit contracts. Fair Trade International has set two standards for producers to adhere to, one for hired labor and one for small producers who are often operating in the informal sector. Could you please elaborate on these standards, their impact, and also give an example on the role of social dialogue in this regard?
Thank you, Youssef. And thank you to the Global Deal for inviting myself and Fair Trade International to be part of this important discussion. Fair trade exists to promote trade justice and to promote that fairly across the full value chain. And we do that by putting the mark on products and having a certification scheme that backs up that promise to consumers. The global network spans about 1.9 million farmers and workers, and we have 1,880 producer organizations in our network, and that's across more than 70 countries. Our standards cover also specific agricultural products. So we have standards for coffee, for bananas, for cocoa and cane sugar, but also in areas like cut flowers and artisan gold from small-scale mines. And when you, as a consumer, last year bought a fair trade marked product, that meant that over 190 million euros of premium went directly to the producers. This is an additional payment above and beyond the minimum price that fair trade is well known for. So I want to thank you for your purchases of fair trade products, and I want to ask you to double those next year. Thank you. Respect for human rights and dignity of every person is at the core of our work at Fair Trade. And we do work with a number of very vulnerable groups, so women, young people, indigenous groups, and of course, as was said, these can often lack very formal contracts with basic health, freedom of association, not there, adequate wages, very important to us. And we believe that social dialogue is of fundamental importance to ensure that workers can influence the terms and conditions of their employment. And that, in fact, is why we joined the Global Deal 5 years ago. And as you rightly state, Fair Trade has two core sets of standards, one which is for our small producer organizations, and one for the large management-run farms that employ regular workers covered under the hired labor standard. So we have about we have precisely 1,544 small producer organizations and 336 certified as hired labor organizations. Of course, this is very needed because they're very different types of organizations and very different types of workforce and then labor requirements. And there's different sizes, the difference in, the family element of ownership and labor, and also the formalization of those organizations. And these standards, which are based on the ILO core conventions, are fundamentally there to ensure fair trade terms between farmers and buyers. It's also to protect workers' rights and the social conditions, and to provide the framework for producers to build thriving farms and organizations. So in this way, our standards cover social, economic, and environmental aspects of business. You may know that fair trade is mostly known for pricing and a fair price, and we can measure and monitor the positive impact we have on incomes in the supply chains. What you may not understand is that we are also, the research shows that we contribute directly to decent work and workers' voice and dignity. And this is around better working conditions. So for example, contracts, paid overtime, health and safety requirements, as well as workers' rights and representation, all form part of our standards. Our experience with our agricultural workers, many who are very rural, as you would expect, is that we find non-standard forms of employment, some in the large farms and plantations, but more so in our small producer organizations. These are mostly family-run, and of course, they themselves are bringing in labor to help with things like the harvest, and this might be done, for example, through labor brokers. And sometimes the earnings, not just for the farmer owning the farm, and the workers, both are experiencing low levels of earnings. And for these workers employed on small-scale farms, we have strict minimum labor requirements in our standards. So this is in terms of child labor, forced labor, freedom of association. All of these apply to any type of worker, whether they're permanent or temporary, working for that organization. And when we look at our hired labor standard, we have additional requirements relating to freedom of association, specific trade union rights, health and safety, and employment. All of this is additional in the hired labor standard. Our goal is to support sound industrial relations where workers and managers build a relationship based on trust and respect. And in doing this, we have a very active Workers' Rights Advisory Committee in Fair Trade, the RAC, who regularly, once a year, they report to the board and raise issues to the board. And they work with us in terms of strategic issues and also looking specifically at our standards. So there's recently been a meeting of the RAC in Nairobi where they gave very valuable feedback around the hired labor, flowers and plants, and fresh fruit standards. And I would invite everyone here that when we launch the formal consultation process for our hired labor standard next year, to input into that. Because this is a fundamental element of the fair trade standards. These are not standards which are created by a small team in an office. This is widely consulted. And for example, the recent cocoa standard had over 250 people, both online and in person. And the small producer organization standard had over 1,000 to consult. And so it's very active. This includes trade unions, government organizations, civil society, and of course the farmers and workers themselves and the small SPOs in that case. I want to give you one example because I want to talk a little bit more specifically about social dialogue. An example that's not about social dialogue, but it's an enabler to allow us to get to social dialogue. Because we also recognize that we have some people hidden in our supply chains. And it's often the people who are working for the small producer organizations. And so, for example, we understand that in the Ivory Coast and Ghana, sharecropping and tenant farming are common models for cocoa. And of course, we work with about 440,000 small-scale cocoa farmers, 90% of which are in West Africa. And we understood that this sharecropping and tenant farming was a feature of that. And so we carried out some research, and we learned that 50% of those farms are run by sharecroppers. Now, in our model, it's the owners of the farms who are the members of fair trade. So in a sense, some of these people were hidden. They're invisible to us. So what we did is we changed the standards, and we did 3 important things. One is that we said sharecroppers, tenant, caretaker farmers must be included in the registries irrespective of whether they're the SPO member or not. We also say that as part of the standard, they must have a formal contract with the landowner and that they must be included in the reporting elements. This is a critical and first step of us finding and making these people visible who are actually doing the work, so that we can then lead to strengthening and eventual involvement in social dialogue. Another example I want to give, and I was pleased to speak to the Labor Minister of the Dominican Republic, who spoke earlier about some of the work that we did in the Dominican Republic with some of the migrant workers who are particularly active in the banana sector. And this is an example of social dialogue that we're very proud of. The Latin American Network of Fair Trade Producers, the CLAC, led and initiated and supported a national dialogue process to address the lack of formal recognition of some of the Haitian migrants who are working on the banana plantations. And this included labor rights NGOs, trade union organizations, the National Organization for Banana Exporters. Because when we went to monitor the certification of these organizations, when we see these workers, we say we need to help solve this problem. And this has resulted in a great solution over the last couple of years, also with the support of the government from the Dominican Republic. Speaking of bananas, we've also led discussions on the World Banana Forum. This is some dozens of organizations, and this is real cross-border collaboration. And in this way, the relationship is improving the economic conditions in the banana labor market. So those are a couple of examples of the steps that Fair Trade is taking. We recognize there's much more to be done, and we're very keen that Fair Trade plays its part and its role to promote social dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation on what you are doing in different regions of the world. And I think the example of Ghana and Dominican Republic are very interesting to illustrate the role of social dialogue in bringing together different actors from the civil society, employers, workers' organizations in promoting the question of fair trade. We have heard from our panelists. Let me now ask you same question to all of you. And let me start with you, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister. in terms of non-standard forms of employment, or, as I said in the beginning of my statement, diverse forms of work arrangement. Because, as I said, we do refer to this in a different way, depending on the context. What is the number one issue or question that needs to be addressed urgently? And how can social dialogue help in shaping the measures and policies to tackle this specific urgent issue that need to be addressed?
Quelle question.
What a question. It's indeed a very important question, but I want to echo what Minister Diaz mentioned earlier in her presentation by saying that we should re-question the notion of progress. And I think that it is indeed the case, not because I do an order through an application on a smartphone and that it's delivered in a few minutes to my domicile. It's not necessarily progress. We have to envisage that question in a much broader way, in a more macro way. We have to look at it in a more global way and really see how these different types of economies and atypical type of work have as a consequence on society, what the consequences are for our living together, and particularly for those who have to work, participate within the context of this atypical way of working in a stricter way without it necessarily being chosen. We mustn't underestimate the fears, the uncertainties that are growing, generated by these new ways of employment, these new types of atypical work among those who are obliged to work in that way. And I think that we really have to bear that in mind, and it questions indeed the concept or the notion of progress in a socio-economic context, highly impacted by the energy crisis, the war in Ukraine, characterized by a kind of growing uncertainty in the future of the economy and the world of labor, which is affecting more strongly those who, not by choice, but who are now obliged to work in atypical ways of employment. And I think we really have to ask ourselves about the challenges here in constituting social rights. We know that these types of employment generate very little, if anything, of social rights, whether it is a protection against sickness, invalidity, a protection against unemployment, a constitution, the right to retirement. So we really have to see that these do not infringe rights now and in the future. And we also have to remember that employment tomorrow will continue to allow you to live in a dignified way and to have a dignified life thanks to your work, and to be able to face a whole series of needs. We know that for certain forms of atypical employment, that is not the case. That is also an element of concern. And one of the challenges which we have to attack as a priority, the third element and the third concern, major worry, is the question of the necessary reconciliation between private life and professional life. We know that these atypical types of work, because of the flexibility that it needs and that it allows you to respond to, are difficult to reconcile with a family life, with a personal life, because of the times of work, or for being able to foresee your work timetables and necessary availability in order to be able to respond to that flexibility. And I could cite other examples. So we really do have to have these concerns in mind, and then they must be at the top of the agenda in order to ensure that tomorrow we may be able to continue to combine the flexibility which is necessary. We've seen that with a number of companies in order to face challenges, new challenges, but also to be able to combine that with a fair social protection, a fair payment for the women and men who work, and the possibility of being able to reconcile professional life with personal life. And in order to achieve that, I think that there is one solution, and that is indeed to feed the social dialogue. And we've seen that in the COVID crisis, that the social partners were willing to provide solutions to new crises unseen before, and to face situations and challenges that were at the time unknown. And so the social partners are one of the important responses, and perhaps the fastest, to all of these challenges. And so I plead so that we can indeed favor and nourish and accompany this necessary social dialogue, which sometimes requires some courage, trust, commitment, but we were often also confronted, and one of the examples that I gave before, the failure of social dialogue or agreement in the short term. But in the medium and in the long term, I think that it is one of the only ways of being able to respond and to attack these challenges of the current world and the future world in terms of flexibility, in terms of atypical, of non-typical of employment, and to respond to the different challenges that we are currently facing today. Thank you. Thank you very much. I will now turn to Madame Hassan, asking her the same question. What is the urgent matter when we're talking about non-standard working or diverse types of employment? What is the urgent question that we have to deal with? How can social dialogue help in this quest to find a solution to this urgent matter? Do you share the point of view? Do you agree with the Deputy Prime Minister of Belgium?
His point of view, and I too believe that it's very difficult to single out one issue that needs to be addressed urgently. What I can say is that the Government of Canada is working on multiple fronts to better support non-standard workers. From a labor protection perspective, we have consistently heard from Canadians and stakeholders that they believe the key issue is misclassification. Through misclassification, gig workers and non-standard workers are wrongfully denied access to job protections under existing labor law, such as the right to unionize and bargain collectively, occupational health and safety protections, basic labor standard protections such as minimum wage and paid sick leave. Over the last years, we, the Government of Canada, have taken steps to address this issue. We introduced a prohibition on misclassification in the Canada Labour Code and have piloted proactive enforcement initiatives. As part of the work being done to entitle gig workers to job protections under the code, we are examining additional policy responses to further address misclassification in federal sectors. Along with ensuring greater access to labor protection, the government is also working to ensure that all workers have the income supports they need in the face of job loss or other career interruptions. The COVID pandemic highlighted how many non-standard workers do not have access to Canada's social safety net. And so to solve this key issue, the Government of Canada is currently working on a commitment to modernize the employment insurance system. This will help ensure a more inclusive system that covers all workers. Social dialogue has been and continues to be invaluable in developing possible responses to address these issues and in developing our policy responses to gig work. We have consulted with labor and employer stakeholders each step of the way. This has helped us better understand the experiences and situation of gig workers and non-standard workers, as well as those employers who actually hire them. Social dialogue helps us understand the complexity of the issues at stake and ensures that our policy interventions are sensible and well-balanced. It's only by consulting with those who will be affected by our responses that we can ensure that we will get things right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that reference to the importance role of social dialogue in ensuring sensible policy responses to this question of addressing misclassification of the different forms of employment. The same question to the social partners. Let me start with you, Sylvain Lobry. So what can you add on this particular question? What is the urgency, if there is one, to be addressed through social dialogue?
Well, I think that the number one challenge I see in our companies, in our businesses, but in our societies as well, is to have a two-speed organization or a two-speed society where people are not treated the same way with the right level of fairness. So this is really the key issue, and that's why I want to stress again this need for negotiation, and I want to stress the virtue of true and deep negotiation, because I think that in this topic of sustainable employment and really fighting the sources of precarious employment, there is, it's not only about what people will get, what workers will get, but also how they get it, and what is the process that is really developing some ownership, some feeling that the result of this is fair, has gone to as far as we could to give them the right access to rights and the right level of dignity and recognition. So I think that negotiation as such and social dialogue, which is based on negotiation, has really a deep virtue to address the main challenges of our societies and of our businesses. This is what I would like to continue to try. This is a tough agenda because there are lots of obstacles, but really this is the way we can develop some common frame for all of us in organization, and this is what we need for the future.
Thank you. Thank you for this very interesting reference to two-speed societies, and the way to avoid that is through social dialogue and negotiations. Mr. Vicentini, so you talked a lot about social dialogue. What else you can add in terms of one urgent, for example, challenge to address through the social dialogue that you have been referring to in your first presentation? Also drawing from the lessons that you have in the different EU countries, for example.
Well, I think that there is a two-faceted emergency at the moment, that is insecurity and exploitation. And these two problems go together very often when it comes to non-standard workers. We need to propose through social dialogue concrete solutions. And when it comes to insecurity, concrete solution means first that we need to limit as much as possible the use of non-standard work only to circumstances where it's really justified and with clear motivations and criteria to get access to that for employers. The second element is that we have to make sure that non-standard workers, when they finish their work, their job, they need to have proper access to unemployment benefits as the other normal workers, and very often they are not entitled to that. So we have to make sure through legislation and social dialogue that this will be the case in the future. And then we need to make sure that more in general, non-standard workers have real access to social protection. That means health care protection, that means health and safety, which means also the possibility to have a decent pension at the end of their career, especially if their career is very discontinued and fragmented, and also the possibility to have access to financing, to housing, and so on and so forth. And last but not least, non-standard workers have to be entitled to have proper lifelong learning and education and training, otherwise it will be impossible for them to navigate in this very insecure labour market. And when it comes to exploitation, we need to make sure all together, governments and social partners, that to avoid exploitation from happening, we need to guarantee proper protection of rights for all non-standard workers, non-discrimination when they are at work, the possibility to have real access to algorithms and any other instrument in the digital economy through which non-standard work is implemented by the employers. Data protection is also very crucial for non-standard workers, sometimes even more important than for standard employees. And of course, we need to protect working conditions. How to do that is the real question, because on the one side we need to have proper legislation in place. Not everything can be resolved by social dialogue, not everything can be resolved by negotiations, because as I said before, negotiations take place in a limited number of sectors. So we need to make sure that we have really rules in place in each and every country that really secure security and non-exploitation, non-discrimination for non-standard workers. But we need also to make sure that non-standard workers, but also genuine self-employed, can have really access to collective bargaining, to social dialogue, can really become members of a union, can organize themselves, to increase their power and to make sure they are not exploited. These are the elements on which we have to work all together, and I think if we do it in a proper manner, we can succeed in improving the working conditions and the living conditions as well for non-standard workers.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this also very interesting proposals on what can be done to address what you said, the urgency of ensuring that all workers access to social protection, labor protection, including also protection against non-discrimination and so on and so forth, but also access to freedom of association and collective bargaining. So this is very useful, and we do retain that both social dialogue and labor legislation working together, being used together, will lead to that. Melissa.
Thank you.
I think I'm moving on the watch. We still have a few minutes, so the same question to you. If you can also share with us what would be the urgent challenge to be addressed, and also the role of social dialogue in that regard.
Okay. So when I was thinking about this challenge, I thought what we don't want to do is be here next year or the year after, and talk about how many more people have been pushed into non-standard forms of employment. And I think that in this way, if we can avoid putting further people into that category, we should look at things like legislation which is well intended, like the HREDD proposals, and make sure that it doesn't have unintended consequences for the millions of small-scale farmers and agricultural workers worldwide. And this is something that we can do something collectively about now. In fair trade, we are always looking at how can we have a fair distribution of value across the value chain. And this of course, has a lot to do with the price which is paid. And we advocate to ensure that the price that's paid covers the cost of sustainable production. And we'd also support tax incentives for sustainable production. But right now, paying low prices for commodities, which is what we're seeing with the economic situation, inevitably leads to exploitation of farmers and workers. And it's these farmers and workers who are feeling more of the pinch of that. At Fair Trade, we monitor very closely with lots of data and research the costs that we're seeing across the supply chains by the farmers and workers. And the production costs are spiraling. The things that you would expect, like fuel, for example, like logistics, for example, but we're also seeing things like fertilizers and packaging materials, and of course, the big costs of hiring workers. And we think that, the living income to be earned by farmers and the living wages to be earned by workers is essentially a human right. And here we're talking about human rights legislation. And I'll just give you one example about bananas. Is about 50% of the cost of a box of bananas is to do with the labor. So obviously the wage levels are very, very important. And we've just increased the banana prices, the minimum price for bananas. This is our highest increase in several years. So we increased it by almost 5% at the farm level and a further 15% for those producers who are exporting directly. And this is really important. In Latin America and the Caribbean, we're seeing cases where producers are reducing the number of full-time workers, moving those to subcontracted roles, or even pushing them into the informal economy. And also replacing skilled workers with unskilled workers, the consequence of which is the quality of the fruit can be lower, and of course leading to lower prices. And this runs the risk of even more people being pushed into poverty. 70% of fair trade certified goods are exported to the European market, so all of this really matters to us. And we welcome the European Commission's proposal for the broad human rights due diligence legislation. And we're actively like to see that living income is part of that, and that purchasing practices by companies are fair and sustainable. Because what we cannot have is that companies are cutting and running if they find an environmental or human rights risk in their supply chains. It must be that they're committed to sticking with those suppliers, and that together, through social dialogue with different stakeholders, the way to address those challenges is agreed. And this is where we see a way that we can work together to address a critical issue so that we are not talking about this numbers increasing. And I'm just going to, while we're mentioning legislation, I'm just going to say that we're very supportive of the ILO's position that social dialogue, that governments should regulate this to a supportive legal environment, because there's still too many countries where fair trade is working, where we operate, where the legislative barriers to freedom of association. So we would advocate for a multilateral model of social dialogue with producers, workers, and their representative organizations at the heart of the process, but also, of course, where the buyers are actively at the table. And we want to work together to continue successful social dialogue models. That would be critical to ensure HREDD legislation does not have unintended consequences, but in fact works for the workers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this also intervention, supplementing what has been said by the other panel members. And I do retain from what you have said that we need both social dialogue at the national level, but also at the cross-border level. Mm-hmm. So these two, let's say, layers of social dialogue will help, as you said, to move out of this, to move and to push outside different forms of work where the social protection is not there, more people. Mm-hmm. So that's a very interesting word that you shared with us. I'm looking at my watch. I think we are now coming close to this session. I turn to the colleagues. Do we have time to take questions from the audience or no? Alessandro? One question. I think it would be fair to the audience to give them a chance to, okay? So we can take two questions? And then we go for the cocktail, right? Okay, so I think I am happy to say that, yes, we can take two questions from the audience. Who would like to questions or comments on what has been said? Yes? Please, can you please introduce yourself when asking the question, and maybe also say to whom, unless it is addressed to all the panelists. Thank you.
Okay. I'm Jean-Christophe Siberas. I'm the coordinator of the French Global Deal Platform. I have a question for Sylvain and for Melissa. Do you work together? And because Sylvain is using farmers' product to make Danone food, and Melissa is kind of regulating this business. So my question is, do you work together?
You can take second
Shall
question
I
or
start?
comments. Yes.
My answer is that we need to work together. I don't know if some Danone teams work with fair trade teams in some countries, but definitely we need to, and we will, I think, in the future. So this is not my specific area of responsibility, but definitely the fact that we enlarge the scope of our commitment, our ability to address the working conditions, situations in our end-to-end supply chain, including agriculture, is a must, is something that we need to do in the future. This is extremely complex, and in fact, we need organizations like Fairtrade to do it efficiently with the right access to the right information, to the right players in the field. So looking forward to it.
I would very much welcome Danone and Fairtrade to work together and to see a Fairtrade mark on a Danone product. Maybe sugarcane from our Belize sugarcane farmers, for example, as an opportunity. The way Fairtrade works, as I mentioned, through the mark and the certification. We also work in other ways with companies because we also employ, we do programs, for example. And we just recently launched one in West Africa, working with a large corporate. And this is about, because we see that the model needs not just the Fairtrade mark model, but also different levels of interventions so that we can reach those ambitious goals of living incomes and living wages. And so we are committed to working in lots of different ways with organizations, and we would very much welcome a program together with Danone.
Thank you very much, and also for making a deal. Okay, we can take another question or comment, if there are any. I see none, so I think let me just maybe say that it has been a very rich, I think, discussion. And we have heard the strong messages about the importance of the role of social dialogue when it comes to addressing issues like ensuring that workers' rights are, of course, secured and guaranteed across all the sectors and all the forms of employment. And also social dialogue can service and serve the right of the workers, but also the requirements of enterprise sustainability. And I think that many good experiences have been shared with us from Europe, from Canada, but also some from other regions in the world. I think with this, I would like to ask you to join me in thanking and also giving an applause to our members from the panel, those that are here with us in Madrid, but also those who have joined us from Brussels and also from Ottawa. All to the colleagues from the Global Deal Unit who helped managing this. Now I think the time is to go for the cocktail, and maybe Alessandro, you would like to say where the cocktail will take place?